The night had been long, one of those endless shifts where time drags itself across the floor, and yet my heart beat differently when he walked in. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Just another patient, another file to handle, another tired face with a story behind it. But the moment my eyes met his, something shifted. He wasn't like anyone else who had ever sat across from me. He carried himself with a strange mix of confidence and vulnerability, like someone who had learned to smile even when the world didn't give him reasons to. And that smile, it unsettled me. I had been trained to be composed, professional, the kind of doctor who drew a line so sharp between personal and professional life that no one could ever accuse me of blurring it. But when he sat there, when he spoke in that voice that was calm but threaded with hidden pain, I found myself listening with more than just my ears. I was listening with something far more dangerous, my heart. His name sounded ordinary at first, but the way he carried it made it unforgettable. I repeated it in my mind long after he had spoken it, as though memorizing a secret I wasn't supposed to keep. I remember the way his eyes wandered around the room before they landed back on me, the way he took a deep breath as if deciding whether or not I was safe. In those seconds, I wasn't just his doctor, I was the person he wanted to trust. That thought scared me, more than I admitted to myself. I asked the usual questions, pen scribbling across paper like I always did, but every answer from him seemed to reach me deeper than it should have. His laugh, soft and hesitant, made me want to ask questions that weren't on the form. Questions about what he loved, who he missed, what he dreamed about at night. But I stopped myself, biting back the words, reminding myself that I had no right to want more. Still, I couldn't deny the truth echoing inside me. He was too attractive for me to ignore, too magnetic for me to pretend he was just another name in my files. I found myself noticing details I shouldn't have noticed. The way his hands rested nervously on his knees, his fingers tapping like he was carrying a rhythm only he could hear. The way his lips curved when he tried to make a joke to cover his unease. And most of all, the way his eyes seemed to search mine for something unspoken, as if waiting for me to reveal a part of myself I had buried long ago. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. For years, I had disciplined myself into silence, keeping every trace of my own longing hidden beneath the surface. My life was clean, orderly, professional. People respected me for it. They never suspected the loneliness that wrapped around me when I went home at night, when the lights were off and the house was too quiet. But here he was, unraveling that silence with nothing but his presence. I told myself it was only because he reminded me of my own pain. That must have been it. His words about not being understood, about carrying secrets too heavy to share with most people, they resonated with me because they mirrored my own life. That was all it was. That was the excuse I clung to. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. This was more than empathy. This was attraction. Dangerous, undeniable attraction. When the session ended, I stood there longer than I should have, pretending to organize papers so I wouldn't have to face how badly I wanted to prolong the moment. He thanked me with a smile that felt too warm for such a formal space, and I nodded as though it meant nothing. But when the door closed behind him, I felt it, the room was suddenly emptier than it had been before. I leaned back in my chair, heart thudding in a way it hadn't in years. I wanted to shake it off, to tell myself it was a mistake, just a flicker of weakness. Yet every part of me knew it wasn't just that. Something had begun, something I couldn't name, something I shouldn't want but already did. And as much as I tried to deny it, a truth had already carved itself inside me. He wasn't just a patient. He was the beginning of a story I wasn't ready for but couldn't turn away from. The third time he came, I knew I was losing the fight with myself. All week I had promised that I would be distant, colder, that I would let the boundary stand tall between us. But when he walked in, when his smile brushed against me like sunlight after a storm, I knew I was lying to myself. It was impossible to be detached with him sitting across from me, impossible to pretend his presence didn't stir something inside me that I had tried to bury for years. I watched him settle into the chair, and I caught myself noticing details I had no right to notice. The way his shirt clung just right across his shoulders, the way his fingers fiddled nervously with the sleeve of his jacket before he pushed it back. These were things I shouldn't be cataloging as a professional, but my eyes and heart seemed to move on their own, betraying me every second. He started speaking almost immediately, not about symptoms or medicine, but about himself, his past, the small pieces of his life he had never shared with anyone else. He told me about the first time he realized he was different, how it made him feel both liberated and terrified. He told me about friends who had drifted away when he finally spoke his truth, about family who couldn't look him in the eye without judgment pressing into their words. His voice trembled sometimes, but he didn't stop talking. And I listened with a hunger I couldn't explain, not the hunger of a doctor trying to diagnose but of a man trying to understand another man's soul. Every word he spoke reached into me like it was pulling out fragments of my own history. I remembered what it felt like to hide, to lower my voice when someone asked questions too close to the truth, to smile and pretend when I was crumbling inside. His story wasn't mine, yet it felt as though we had walked parallel roads, never meeting until now. And that realization, that he was a reflection of my own hidden self, made everything even more dangerous. Somewhere in the middle of his words, his eyes found mine, steady and searching, and I couldn't look away. It wasn't a patient looking at a doctor. It was a man looking at another man, testing the waters, silently asking if there was something more here than just professional concern. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, but I didn't break the gaze. I held it longer than I should have, long enough for both of us to know that something had shifted. The air between us felt heavier, thicker, carrying something unsaid that neither of us dared to put into words. He smiled then, not the polite smile he had worn before, but one tinged with something warmer, almost intimate. And when he laughed at some joke he made to cover the silence, I found myself laughing too, even though the joke wasn't that funny. It was never about the words, it was about the way he looked at me when he said them. That night, after he left, I couldn't stop replaying every second in my mind. The way his voice had lowered when he spoke about being lonely. The way his hand brushed his hair back and lingered there when he hesitated, waiting for me to respond. The way he looked at me, as though I wasn't just a doctor behind a desk, but a person he wanted to know. I hated myself for it and yet I craved it. I told myself I was helping him, that listening, encouraging, guiding, that was my job. But the truth burned inside me, I wasn't just helping him. I was falling for him. And that single truth threatened to unravel everything I had built in my life. Still, when I closed my eyes that night, I didn't see my desk, my paperwork, or my career. I saw his eyes holding mine, daring me to feel what I had spent so long pretending I didn't deserve. I tried to tell myself it wouldn't happen, that the line would hold firm, that the weight of my oath and the years of training that taught me about distance and control would be stronger than whatever I was feeling. But life doesn't ask for permission before it blurs boundaries, and that evening it became clearer than ever. He stayed after his appointment had technically ended, his words spilling into the quiet of the room like a confession that refused to be contained. I should have told him to leave, to keep things strictly professional, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, listening as though every detail of his story was meant for me alone. His voice carried an honesty that made the air feel fragile. He spoke about how tired he was of pretending, how exhausting it had become to wear masks just to survive the day. He said he felt like a stranger in his own life, and as I listened, something inside me cracked. I knew that feeling too well. I knew what it was like to walk through days as though they belonged to someone else, to silence your truth so completely that even you began to forget it was real. I don't know if it was the way his voice dropped into something softer, or the way his eyes glistened with emotions he tried to hold back, but something in me slipped. I put down the pen, folded my hands together, and let the silence stretch. He looked at me, waiting, searching for something in my face. And without planning it, without thinking of consequences, I let my guard fall. I said, "You're not alone." Simple words, but I could feel the weight of them. For a second, his whole expression shifted. His shoulders eased as if a burden had been lifted, and there was a gentleness in his smile that nearly broke me. It wasn't the kind of smile patients gave doctors, it was the kind two souls exchanged when they recognized themselves in each other. He stayed even longer after that, and the conversation drifted far beyond where it should have gone. We weren't talking about his condition anymore. We were talking about music, about books that had left a mark on us, about dreams that felt impossible but too beautiful to let go. The walls of the office, once sterile and impersonal, felt warmer, almost intimate, as if we were the only two people who existed in that moment. And then it happened. It wasn't planned, it wasn't something I even thought was possible until it unfolded. He laughed at something I said, leaned forward just slightly, and for a second his hand brushed mine across the desk. It was nothing more than a graze, the faintest contact, but my entire body reacted as if lightning had struck. My breath caught, my heart raced, and I froze. I should have pulled back, should have ended the session right then, but I didn't. I looked up, and his eyes were already locked on mine, steady and unflinching. There was no confusion in them, no hesitation. There was only recognition, like he knew what I was feeling because he felt it too. The silence between us grew unbearable. My throat went dry, my pulse thudded in my ears, and for a terrifying, exhilarating moment, I let myself want it. I let myself imagine reaching across the space, closing the distance, allowing what had been building between us to finally spill over. I didn't, not then, but the damage was already done. We both knew. When he finally stood to leave, he paused by the door, lingering in a way that said everything words couldn't. He looked back at me, his expression soft, almost vulnerable, as though he was asking me to admit what neither of us dared to speak aloud. I nodded, just slightly, and that tiny gesture felt like a promise, like an admission that the line I had sworn to protect had already been crossed in the heart if not yet in the body. After the door closed behind him, I sat in the silence, my hands trembling. The rules I had lived by all my life seemed smaller, weaker, and for the first time, I didn't know if I even wanted to follow them anymore. The days that followed felt different, as though something invisible had shifted in the air. I carried myself through work with the same practiced composure, seeing patients, writing notes, wearing the mask of professionalism I had perfected over the years. But every moment I wasn't with him, I was thinking about him. His voice, his smile, the way his eyes had lingered on mine before he left, all of it replayed in my mind like a song I couldn't turn off. I told myself I had to stop, that I had to shut down whatever this was before it grew out of control, but my heart didn't listen. It beat faster every time I thought of him, every time I imagined the possibility of what lay between us. When he came in again, the room felt charged before either of us spoke. There was no mistaking it anymore. We both knew we were not doctor and patient in that moment, we were two men holding back a tide of emotion that refused to be contained. He sat down across from me, but this time the desk between us felt like a wall neither of us wanted. I couldn't stop noticing the way his gaze softened when it landed on me, the way his posture shifted as if he was more at ease here than anywhere else. He began to talk, but not about what he was supposed to. He told me he had been thinking about me too, that my words lingered with him long after our conversations ended. He admitted that he felt lighter here, as though he could finally breathe without pretending. Hearing that should have terrified me. Instead, it filled me with warmth so deep it hurt. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, but the truth slipped through anyway. I told him I felt it too, that something about him had broken through walls I thought were unshakable. His expression softened even more at that, and for a long time we simply sat there, staring at each other, letting the silence speak louder than any words. That night, for the first time, we met outside of the clinic. It wasn't planned. It happened by accident, or maybe by fate, when we crossed paths in the city. The rules should have stopped me, but the moment I saw him standing there, smiling like it was meant to be, I couldn't resist. We walked together, first aimlessly, then with purpose, wandering streets lit by the glow of street lamps. Our conversation spilled into laughter, into quiet admissions, into small moments that felt far too big to ignore. There was no desk between us now, no sterile walls, just two men walking side by side, realizing they were stepping into something dangerous but real. At some point, without planning, our hands brushed. Neither of us pulled away. And then his fingers slid into mine, slowly, carefully, as though he was giving me a chance to refuse. But I didn't. I held his hand, my chest tight with a mix of fear and joy, and the world around us seemed to disappear. For a while, it was just us, two men who had been hiding for too long, finally allowing themselves a sliver of truth. We talked for hours, about nothing and everything. He told me about his dreams, about wanting to find a place where he didn't have to shrink himself to fit in. I told him pieces of myself I had never spoken aloud before, pieces that had lived locked away in silence. And with every word, every glance, every step closer, I felt myself sinking deeper into something I couldn't turn back from. By the time we parted that night, I knew it was too late. We had crossed the line, not in the way people might expect, but in ways that mattered even more. Emotionally, spiritually, we had stepped into a territory where rules no longer held power. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing with both fear and longing. I knew the risk I was taking. I knew what it could cost me. But I also knew this was the first time in years I felt alive, the first time in years I wasn't just existing, I was feeling. And I couldn't let it go. The following weeks became a dangerous mix of joy and dread, as if every moment with him stitched new light into my life while at the same time pulling at the seams of everything I had worked so hard to protect. At the clinic I tried to wear the same expression, the same calm voice and controlled manner I had always carried, but something in me had changed, and people noticed. My colleagues made small remarks about how distracted I seemed, how my focus was slipping, and though they said it half-jokingly, their words left a sting because they were true. My phone buzzed during meetings, and I would catch myself glancing at the screen just to see his name, the smallest message enough to make my chest tighten. I thought I was careful, but the truth is, when someone brings color into a life that has been gray for so long, it shows, no matter how hard you try to hide it. He, on the other hand, wasn't afraid in the same way I was. He would tease me about my serious face, about how I carried the weight of the world on my shoulders even when I didn't need to. He pushed me gently, not to be reckless, but to stop living as though love was something forbidden. One night when we met outside the city, in a quiet park where no one would know us, he told me he couldn't keep hiding forever. His voice trembled when he said it, not from fear but from determination. "Why should we be ashamed of this?" he asked, his hand brushing mine under the dim glow of the lamps. I wanted to answer him with courage, to say we should stand proud, but the truth tangled in my throat. I thought of my reputation, my career, the years I had built carefully like a fragile tower that could topple with one wrong move. I told him I needed time, that the world we lived in was not as forgiving as he wanted it to be. He sighed, looking away, and in that sigh I heard his exhaustion. He had fought for so long just to be himself, and now I was asking him to shrink again, to be quiet again, for me. The guilt of that pressed on me heavier than any rulebook or law. At the clinic, whispers began to stir. People noticed how often his name appeared on my schedule, how my expression softened in ways it didn't with others. A nurse asked me once, in passing, if I was close with him. The question was innocent, but it set off alarms in my head. I denied it quickly, too quickly, and that alone made me uneasy. That night, when I met him, I told him about it. He smiled in that way he did when he was both amused and sad, and he said, "Do you see? Hiding doesn't protect us. It just eats us alive." His words struck deep, because he was right. I had built my entire life around hiding, believing it was the only way to survive, but surviving and living are not the same thing. Still, the fear clung to me. I began to imagine every scenario, being discovered, being reported, losing the trust of everyone around me. I pictured my name dragged into places I didn't want it to go, my career shattered by whispers turning into accusations. And yet, none of those thoughts made me stop seeing him. I couldn't. When we were together, away from the clinic, away from the noise of rules and judgment, I felt free. I felt like the man I was supposed to be, not the version of myself the world demanded. There was one evening, in particular, that burned itself into my memory. We had gone out of the city, far enough that no one would recognize us, and we sat by the water, the moonlight reflecting on the surface. He leaned against me, his head resting on my shoulder, and for a moment the silence was everything. My arm wrapped around him almost naturally, as though it belonged there. In that stillness, I realized that no matter how much I feared the consequences, I had already made my choice. I had chosen him, even if I hadn't spoken the words yet. That realization was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because I knew what it could cost me. Liberating because I finally admitted to myself what my heart had known from the very first day he walked through my door. It all came crashing down the night he told me he couldn't keep doing this. His voice didn't hold anger, only sorrow, but that somehow hurt worse. We were sitting in his apartment, the faint glow of the lamp throwing shadows across his face, and he said it quietly, as if speaking too loud would make it unbearable. "I care about you too much to be the reason you lose everything," he whispered, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket draped across the couch. I froze, my chest tightening with panic, because those words sounded like the beginning of an ending. I tried to respond quickly, to tell him he was wrong, that we could find a way, but he cut me off gently. He looked at me with eyes that were both tender and firm, eyes that carried the weight of all his years of hiding, and he said, "You're scared. And I don't blame you. But I've lived my whole life shrinking for other people. I can't shrink for us too." My throat burned as though I had swallowed fire. Everything he said was true. I had been holding him in the shadows, keeping what we had locked away as though it was something shameful when in truth it was the only thing in my life that felt pure. But fear had chained me, and those chains were hurting him. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. My mind raced through every memory, his laughter on the nights we walked under street lamps, the softness of his hand in mine when we thought no one could see, the way his voice calmed something in me that no medicine ever could. The thought of losing those moments, losing him, was unbearable. Yet here he was, preparing himself to step away because I hadn't been brave enough to step forward. I leaned closer, desperate, my words trembling. "Don't leave. Please, don't. I can't lose you." My voice cracked, and it was the first time in years I had let anyone hear me break. His eyes softened at my plea, but he shook his head slowly, as though trying to protect me even while hurting himself. "I love what we have," he said, "but I need more than stolen hours and hidden glances. I need a love that can breathe." His words cut through me. I wanted to promise him that I could give that I could be the man he deserved, but the fear still pressed on my chest like a weight. What would happen if I admitted it openly? What would happen to my career, to everything I had built? The thoughts swirled like a storm, but when I looked at him, when I saw the pain in his eyes, the storm began to clear. What good was a career, a reputation, a life of order, if it meant living empty? What good were all those walls if they kept me from the one thing that made me feel alive? I reached for his hand, and this time I didn't let it go. My fingers held his tightly, almost desperately, and I whispered, "I've been afraid my whole life. Afraid of being seen, of being judged, of losing control. But with you, I'm more afraid of losing this. Losing you." His lips parted slightly, his breath catching, and in that moment, the distance we had carried between us shattered. I leaned in, not with hesitation this time but with certainty, and our lips finally met. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't reckless, it was the kind of kiss that carried every unspoken word, every suppressed longing, every quiet truth we had both been holding back. When we pulled away, his forehead rested against mine, and I whispered, "You're not just a patient. You're my heart." The tears in his eyes glistened, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt freedom. The days after that night felt different, as though a veil had been lifted from my life. For so long I had been moving carefully, watching every step, keeping my heart under lock and key, but once I kissed him, once I admitted what I felt, there was no going back. I woke up each morning with a new sense of clarity, like the weight I had carried my whole life was finally loosening. Yet clarity didn't mean things got easier. The reality of what we had done hung heavy in the back of my mind. At work I felt eyes on me, real or imagined, and every time someone mentioned his name at the reception desk, my chest tightened. I didn't want to lie anymore, but I also knew the truth could ruin me in ways I wasn't ready for. Still, the fear wasn't enough to keep me from him. If anything, it made me run toward him harder, as if trying to hold on to every second we had in case it all fell apart. We stopped pretending outside the walls of my office. We met in open places, not crowded, not reckless, but open enough that someone might notice if they were looking. The first time we walked down a quiet street holding hands without letting go, I felt both exposed and liberated. The night air was cool against my skin, but the warmth of his fingers threading through mine made me feel untouchable. He smiled at me, that kind of smile that came from the soul, and whispered, "This is how it should be." In that moment, I believed him. At work the rumors grew louder. A colleague mentioned that I seemed different lately, more alive, more distracted. Another joked about whether someone had caught my attention outside of work. I laughed it off, pretending it was nothing, but my heart pounded every time. I knew I was walking on fragile ground, and sooner or later I'd have to choose between the life I had built and the life I wanted. The choice haunted me until one evening when I sat alone in my office long after hours. The papers on my desk blurred in front of my eyes, not from exhaustion but from the tears I didn't want to admit were there. I thought about all the years I had wasted hiding, all the chances I had let slip away because I was afraid of being seen. And then I thought about him, about how he deserved more than half love in the shadows. He deserved someone who would stand beside him in the light. That night I made the decision that changed everything. I handed in my resignation a week later. My colleagues were shocked, some even tried to talk me out of it, but I had already made peace with the choice. I wasn't leaving because of failure. I was leaving because I finally wanted to live without fear, because I wanted to love without apology. Walking out of that building for the last time felt surreal, like closing a chapter of a book I had been trapped in for too long. He was waiting for me outside, and when I saw him standing there, I knew I had done the right thing. He looked at me with pride in his eyes, not just love but respect, as though he understood the cost of the decision and honored it. We built a new life slowly, carefully, but together. There were whispers from people who didn't understand, judgment from those who thought they had the right to define us, but those voices grew quieter as we grew stronger. He found peace in being loved openly, and I found peace in finally allowing myself to give that love without chains. We shared small joys, cooking together in a tiny kitchen, late-night walks where the world felt ours alone, mornings where waking up beside him reminded me that I had made the right choice no matter what I had left behind. Sometimes I still thought about the risks, about what could have been if I had chosen differently, but those thoughts faded quickly when he smiled at me or whispered my name in the quiet hours. Because the truth was clear now. I hadn't crossed a line, I had crossed into the life I was meant to live. And though the road here was messy and filled with fear, it had led me to him, and that was enough. We weren't just a secret anymore. We were a story, untold for too long, finally finding its voice in the open air. And in that story, I was no longer just a doctor bound by rules. I was a man who had learned that love, when it's real, is worth any price.